Welcome to Srimad Bhagavatam class. We continue in the 4th canto, chapter 21, entitled Instructions by Maharaj Prithu. We are at text 35. Here we go, the word by word. Pradana Kalashaya Dharma Sangrahe Sharira Esha Pratipatya Chetanam Kriya Palatvena Vibhur Vibhavyate Yathanalo Darushu Tatkunatmakaha Pradana Kalashaya Dharma Sangrahe Pradhana Kalashaya Dharma Sangrahe Sharira Esha Pradipatya Chetanam Sharira Esha Pradipatya Chetanam Kriya Phalatvena Vibhur Vibhavyate Kriya Phalatvena Vibhur Vibhavate Bhavyate Yatha Nalo Darushu Tatkunatmaka Yatha Nalo Darushu Tatkunatmaka Pradhana Kalashaya Dharma Sangrahe Sharira Esha Pradipatya Chetanam Kriya Phalatvena Vibhur Vibhavyate Yatha Nalo Darushu Tatkunatmaka Pradhana Kalashaya Dharma Sangrahe Sharira Esha Pratipatya Chetanam Kriya Phalatvena Vibhur Vibhavyate Yatha Nalo Darushu Tatkunatmaka Pradhana Kalashaya Dharma Sangrahe Sharira Esha Pratipatya Chetanam Kriya Phalatvena Vibhur Vibhavyate Yatha Nalo Darushu Tatkunatmaka. Vaishnavis? Pradhana Kalashaya Dharma Sangrahe Sharira Esha Pratipatya Chetanam Kriya Phaladvena Vibhur Vibhavyate Yatha Nalo Darushu Tatkunatmaka Pradana Material nature Kala Time Ashaya Desire Dharma Occupational duties Sangrahe Aggregate Sharire Body Eshaha This Pratipatya Accepting Chetanam Consciousness Kriya Activities Palatvena by the result of, Vibhu the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Vibhavyate, manifested. Yata, as much as. Analaha, fire. Darushu, in the wood. Tatguna atmakaha, according to shape and quality. Translation purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is all-pervading, but He is also manifested in different types of bodies which arise from a combination of material nature, time, desires, and occupational duties. Thus, different types of consciousness develop, just as fire, which is always basically the same, blazes in different ways according to the shape and dimensions of firewood. Purport. The Supreme Personality of Godhead constantly lives with the individual soul as Paramatma. The individual soul has awareness in accord with his material body, which he attains by virtue of Prakriti, or material nature. The material ingredients are activated by the force of time, and thus the three material modes of nature are manifested. According to his association with the three modes of nature, the living entity develops a particular type of body. In animal life, the material mode of ignorance is so prominent that there is very little chance of realizing the Paramatma, who is also present within the heart of the animal. But in the human form of life, because of developed consciousness, Chetanam, one can be transferred from ignorance and passion to goodness by the results of his activities, Kriya Palatvena. A human being is therefore advised to associate with spiritually advanced personalities. The Vedas, Mukunda Upanishad 1-12, give the direction Tat Vikyanartam Sagurum Eva Bigachet. In order to reach the perfection of life or to understand the real constitutional position of the living entity, one must approach the spiritual master. Gurum eva bigachet. One must. It is not optional. It is imperative that one approach the spiritual master, for by such association one proportionately develops his consciousness towards the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The highest perfection of such consciousness is called Krishna consciousness. According to the body given by Prakriti or nature, one's consciousness is present. According to the development of consciousness, one's activities are performed, and according to the purity of such activities, one realizes the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is present in everyone's heart. The example given herein is very appropriate. Fire is always the same, but according to the size of the fuel or burning wood, the fire appears to be straight, curved, small, big, etc. According to the development of consciousness, God realization is present. In the human form of life, it is therefore recommended that one undergo the different types of penances and austerities described in the Bhagavad Gita. I would leave the rest of the purport so far because I think there's already a lot in there that I would like to refer to. Maybe we get back to the rest if you have time. Om Agyanatimirandasya Gnanjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Karamayam Dadati Svabrantikam Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vagisha Yasya Vadhane Lakshmir Yasya Chavakshasi Yasya The Hridaye Samvit Tam Narasimham Maham Bhaje Pralada Hridayaladam Bhaktavitya Vidaram Sharatinduruchim Vande Pavindra Vandanam Harim. Translation once more. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is all-pervading, but He is also manifested in different types of bodies which arise from a combination of material nature, time, desires, and occupational duties. Thus, different types of consciousness develop, just as fire, which is always basically the same, blazes in different ways according to the shape and dimensions of firewood. So the verse and the purport address three topics that are elaborately discussed in the Bhagavad Gita in the 13th chapter. It's called Nature and Joy and Consciousness. And I would like to take you on a little excursion based on the structure of this purport through the 13th chapter. Because the 13th chapter is regarded by Srila Prabhupada himself as actually even most essential chapter. In many places he emphasizes that, because the three items that are discussed there, Kshetra, Kshetrakriya and Paramatma, or the living entity, the material body and the super soul, are very important to be understood in their correct position, that we don't confuse one with the other, neither the self with the body, nor the Atma with the Paramatma, etc. So Srila Prabhupada makes this abundantly clear in many places. So he starts the purport with saying the Supreme Personality of Godhead constantly lives with the individual soul as Paramatma. And if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, we see that Krishna is speaking. Krishna in the supreme form as the two-handed flute-playing Krishna. But when he talks about the Supreme Lord, he refers a lot to, or describes a lot, what we know as Paramatma, the feature of Vishnu that is governing the material nature. Just in the 18th chapter, we hear that Krishna refers to himself, where he says, only by pure devotional service can one attain me. But before that, like the 13th chapter, like the 6th chapter, they talk a lot about the Paramatma feature, because this is the form of Krishna that accompanies each of us in our material lives, as it is said here in the Bhagavatam. And one verse that very precisely describes the function of the Paramatma is in 13:23. It's called Upadrashtanumantacha Bharata Bhakta Maheshwara Paramatmeti Chapyokto Dehismin Purusha Paraha. The Paramatma is described as Upadrashtan Anumanta. It's said is the overseer and permitter. Bharata is also the controller. Bhakta, the supreme enjoyer. Bhakta Maheshwara, the Supreme Lord. He's considered the other transcendental enjoyer within this body, who is known as the Super Soul. And sometimes, interestingly, Srila Prabhupada refers to the Paramatma as a part of the impersonal aspect of the Lord. And this is because he is also, in a sense, represents a certain law, a dynamic within the material nature, and only actually exists in relationship to material nature. There's no Paramatma like this in Vaikuntha. He has his role and function in the material world. Of course, he originates from Vishnu, who is in Vaikuntha, but the Paramatma is specifically meant to control actually material nature. Kapila Dev explains to his mother in the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam that the Supreme Lord has two controlling functions in regard to matter. One is time, that is also mentioned here, and this is kind of the external control. And internally, or from within, he says the Paramatma is controlling the ways of the living entities. Savasya chaham mrti sanivistu mata smirtya jnanam apohanam ja. He says also he governs our mind, our consciousness, which is also an essential topic here in this verse. That remembrance, forgetfulness, all this comes from the Paramatma. Or all the different functions that we are not aware of within the body are actually controlled under the supervision of the Paramatma. And we hear often the Paramatma being referred to as more or less something of a principle, sometimes also be a bit of an abstract kind of feature or energy. But the Vaishnava school of thought is not going in this direction, saying, it's a principle, like the super soul, like the soul is consciousness. Sometimes we have that because this is what is tangible to human beings, consciousness as a symptom. Also Srila Prabhupada said, the Atma is perceivable to us, or like it is indicated by the presence of consciousness. It's a symptom of the soul, because I'm conscious of things, And the Paramatma is Para, especially Prabhupada translated also in the 13th chapter as transcendental. And he points out, because the Lord is a transcendental enjoyer, he has no business being involved in material activities. The transcendental is beyond and above. So he is the Paramatma not just witnessing, overseeing and permitting the activities of the living entity, but not being himself not involved in any material activity, but being in control of it. And in the second canto, Shukadev Goswami suggests a meditation on this particular Paramatma, which gives us more the personal view that the Paramatma is a particular form with 4 arms, with a particular characteristic, being present in each and everyone's heart. And Krishna also says in the 13th chapter, okay, the Paramatma appears to be divided, but he's not. Because sometimes we might think he expands as many times as there are jivas and accompanies each of them in their bodies. But as said, the Paramatma is one form and is compared in a metaphor like the sun that is present, and wherever you go in different places, the same sun is just right there, although it's different places, different people in different places see the sun, but it's not a different sun. It's the same sun shining on everyone. And it's sometimes explained the Paramatma is the sun, and the jivas like particles of sun rays that are grouped around the Paramatma actually. So there is this one feature that we all perceive, but we perceive difference between each of us. So therefore there's the thought that he's many, but he's one. And here in the Srimad Bhagavatam, in the second chapter, is called The Lord in the Heart. The text number 8 starts with, others conceive of the personality of Godhead residing within the body in the region of the heart and measuring only 8 inches with 4 hands, carrying a lotus, a wheel of a chariot, a conch shell and a club respectively. So the 4 items of Vishnu, and the particular Paramatma form, I forgot the name, maybe it comes back. So here the 8 inches, Srila Prabhupada describes in the purport, if you take our ring finger and the thumb and the distance this makes, this is the size the Paramatma takes within the heart. So according to the body he might be assumed smaller or bigger, but this is like a measurement given in the Srimad Bhagavatam where we can assume, okay, he's residing. And he's not just like plain. He has said his mouth expresses his happiness, his eyes spread like the petals of a lotus, and his garments, yellowish like the saffron of a kadamba flower, are bedecked with valuable jewels. His ornaments are all made of gold, set with jewels, and he wears a glowing headdress and earrings. So I guess most of you are familiar with some illustrations of the Paramatma, where how he's richly decorated like a king, and with all the items like club, conch shell, lotus flower, wheel, and so on. So in this way he's present and he's smiling, he's always happy, because he has a friendshiply inclination toward every living entity, guiding us. So this meditation is suggested, saying one should focus one's mind on the Paramatma as long as the mind is capable to. Because there might be situations, not just when you're very old or about to die, in between you never know, that your mind cannot be really focused on any type of meditation, the holy name of the Lord, or specifically the Paramatma feature. So we are not too much concerned actually with meditating on the Paramatma. Still, it is a feature of Krishna which takes a lot of space in the Bhagavad Gita, as we already mentioned, also in the Srimad Bhagavatam, and is relevant to us because we are right in there with him, in the material nature, the Prakriti. And what does it take? What do you think? What is the condition that needs to be met so that one can perceive or like be connected with the Paramatma? Do you have an idea? Just essentially, what is the necessity or the qualification that a person could reach the Paramatma? Maybe there's a hint in the 6th chapter. Has to do with the...
The 631 sees everything in me, and one who sees me in everything.
Yes, this is also, you are close to the verse. It's like, it's describing, I read you the Sanskrit, it's text 6-7. Chitatmana prashantasya paramatma samahita shitoshna sukha dukeshu tatama panamanayo. For one who has conquered the mind, the super soul is already reached, for he has attained tranquility. To such a man, happiness and distress, heat and cold, honor and dishonor are all the same. So the mind is the medium. If the mind is cleansed, purified, controlled, as it is mentioned here, then transcendental vision is possible. The jiva might perceive the super soul. It is also described according to one's devotional development or inclination, one may perceive the form of the Lord that one is closest with. So the great saints might see in their heart even Krishna himself. For like personalities like Hanuman, as will be Sita, Ram, and so on. But the Paramatma is mainly, aimed for by the yogis and mystics. And Srila Prabhupada in the purport explains, everyone has to abide by a superior dictation. We are never independent. So we always are either under the dictate of Prakriti or the Paramatma, it is said. So these are the three items again, Jiva, Prakriti and Paramatma. And Paramatma, you can understand it like a triangle. Paramatma is right there, then there's Prakriti and the Jiva. And Paramatma controls both. This is his energies, both. No? He also describes that, his superior and inferior energies. And it's said by controlling the mind, I will read you word by word. The effect of controlling the mind is that one automatically follows the dictation of the Paramatma or Supersoul. Simply, that's it. That's one important thing to understand. Why do we attempt so much to get our mind under control? It might work sometimes more, sometimes less. And I guess we do well to simply pray humbly for the ability to do so, because we cannot just, maybe your experience is different, but I see how my mind is like a formidable foe, as like the old English would say, and Arjuna himself compares it to the wind, harder to control than the wind. So, but this is something a bit about the Paramatma feature that is highlighted here in this verse, and I think which is not just worth contemplating of, but it's a requirement to understand that feature of the Lord in order to get closer to understand everything that's happening to us right now in this existence. And then he continues to purport, the individual soul has awareness in accord with his material body, which he attains by virtue of prakriti or material nature. The material ingredients are activated by the force of time, and thus the three material modes of nature are manifested. According to his association with the three modes of nature, the living entity develops a particular type of body. In animal life, the material mode of ignorance is so prominent that there is very little chance of realizing the Paramatma, which is also present within the heart of the animal. But in the human form of life, because of developed consciousness, Chetanam, one can be transferred from ignorance and passion to goodness by the results of his activities. So as we all might be aware that the three modes of nature or gunas are that what covers the soul. They're the three features of material nature. The word guna means quality. It's different meanings. One meaning is quality. And so we adopt or accept qualities, material qualities, which are actually not ours, but based on the hypnotic, influence of the false ego, we are very convinced, yes, that's me. That's the meaning of ahankara, that which makes you think you are something that you are actually not. And another meaning is color. Guna means color, and like the three gunas represented by three colors. Sattva sometimes with white, but then with yellow being represented. Rajas, or like passion, with red, and tamagun with blue. So these are the three core ingredients, and like you can mix all kinds of colors of the base colors. So it said Srila Prabhupada often uses this metaphor to explain how the different 8,400,000 species of life are a mixture of the three gunas. And then the third meaning, rope, meaning you are bound to be that. As soon as we accept a certain body, we are forced to act accordingly, whatever the body dictates by its nature. Might it be then passion, ignorance, or goodness. And although we have categorizations of, for example, animals are sometimes considered being ignorance, or plants. This is a mode of ignorance, right? You have no consciousness. This is one criteria. How accessible is the consciousness of the living entity, or spiritual consciousness? In human beings or demigods considered to be in a mode of goodness. So it's also when you die in a mode of goodness, you go to the heavenly planets. When you die in a mode of passion, you go among human beings. And when you die in a mode of ignorance, you are degraded to the animal kingdom in terms of consciousness. At the same time, we see within each species or category of life, although it's considered tamasic, it has still, again, subdivisions which allow us to make still differences. Like, for example, the cow is in one sense tamoguna because it's an animal. At the same time, it's sattvaguna because it's an animal that produces milk, for example, which is very beneficial for humans. Can be put to work. Is a very beneficial animal. Whereas a tiger is considered rajas because he kills and eats meat and is, like, in that sense different. And the pig is considered being a mode of ignorance. So again, we have, although we think they're all mode of ignorance, they have still differences. Like with plants and trees, is that trees who give fruits are considered more sattvic because they maintain, they contribute. Whereas fruits are like trees and bushes that don't give anything, they're considered mode of ignorance, tamas, nothing to be gained from. Where, for example, poisonous plants and trees, there then could be rajas and so on. And also among human beings, we see that there is a distinction. In Varnashram, we also see that not a human being might be generally referred to as sattvic because it has consciousness, but it can still vary according to the three modes, he said. Chatavanya maya sharishtam guna karma vibhagashaha. And in the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, we find how Krishna picked on the aspect of lust, which is also essentially a mode of nature, passion, but he explains how there are different degrees of lust and how they affect the consciousness of the living entity. And he says here in 338, as fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. Lust must be understood as generally the inclination to enjoy matter in any way. It doesn't refer only to sexual lust. Lust means I see myself as the enjoyer of matter in whatever way. It can be simply the idea I control, I own. This is lust. As soon as we have an attraction to something material, that's essentially it. And here 3 metaphors are being used, and Srila Prabhupada uses them in 2 ways in the purport. One way is that he says the fire covered by smoke is actually representing the human form of life. When there's smoke and fire, there's a little fire visible. So that he says that sparks the consciousness, or that's the consciousness of the human being, which is capable of God realization. So it could be made into a blazing fire if one invests oneself in spiritual life, in spiritual practice. But also it could happen, if you don't do that, then it just gets the smoke completely kills the fire, and then it's same like an animal. Consciousness is lost. And then he also again uses, as we just described before, like the metaphors according to these animals, like who can also be categorized differently, although they might be all considered tamagun within themselves, they can be considered sattvic, rajasic and tamasic. So that's the big task or challenge that is in front of us to protect our spiritual consciousness and to develop it in this human form of life. And here in the purport, Srila Prabhupada continues, he makes, or like as you might remember, he emphasizes very strongly, a human being is therefore advised to associate with spiritual advanced personalities. The Vedas give the direction, tadvikyanartam sagurum evabhigachet. In order to reach the perfection of life or to understand the real constitutional position of the living entity, one must approach the spiritual master. It is not optional. It is imperative that one approach the spiritual master, For by such association one proportionately develops his consciousness toward the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, on one hand we have now the instruction that one should seek out a self-realized soul, a tattvadarshi, which is highlighted in many points. And we can also at the same time have therefore a marker or something, an indicator that where we can, look at in order to assert, did we find someone like that? Similar as if you take the fire analogy, as soon as you're close to fire, you will feel heat and there will be light. You know, if someone says this is a fire but it's dark and you don't feel any heat, then it's most likely not a fire. Right? So similarly, if you're in association with spiritual advanced people in the proper way and culture, and the whole process of inquiry happens, or like as we have in the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Pariprashnena Sevaya, inquiry and service, but you don't get spiritual elevation, then something is missing, something is wrong, and we seriously and critically need to reflect on what is missing. Because just formalities won't do it. Just formally you have accepted someone as guru and you got your initiation and all this. It's not what is said here. It's not the formality counts. No, the process, the power of consciousness counts. That really your consciousness is being influenced. That in this association you're being elevated, you're being inspired, and not just inspired, but also moved to develop yourself spiritually. And since we talked a lot about the 13th chapter already, I would like to go with you there. Yes, just give me a second that I can. Because there also this very element of guru or self-realized person that we should associate with is being highlighted. In 1322, for example, the verse says, the living entity in material nature thus follows the ways of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. This is due to his association with that material nature. Thus he meets with good and evil among various species. So the verse points to the power of association, and in the second paragraph, Srila Prabhupada says, one has to rise, therefore, above the three material modes and become situated in the transcendental position. That is called Krishna consciousness. Unless one is situated in Krishna consciousness, his material consciousness will oblige him to transfer from one body to another, because he has material desires since time immemorial. But he has to change that conception. The change can be affected only by hearing from authoritative sources. The best example is here. Arjuna is hearing the signs of God from Krishna. The living entity, if he submits to this hearing process, will lose his long-cherished desire to dominate material nature, and gradually and proportionately, as he reduces his long desire to dominate, he comes to enjoy spiritual happiness. In the Vedic mantra it is said that as he becomes learned in association with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he proportionately relishes his eternal, blissful life. And then he continues, 28. Maybe let's first bring in another side note. Consciousness is understood as the capacity to truly see. Jagannath Baladev Subhachadev ki jai, Shishi Gaunitai ki jai. It's like the inner vision, because we also translate consciousness as awareness of. If I'm not conscious of something, it's not present within my mind, I don't perceive it. And the words used in the 13th chapter a lot are pasyati and pasyan. Like there are quite a few verses always saying one who sees. And then the verse continues, who sees, like the living entities being within the body, actually doing nothing, the modes doing everything. One who sees that the Paramatma is present within each living entity, etc. This person truly sees. Or we could translate, this person is really conscious. So if I'm able to truly perceive, have an inner vision of, like how I'm a spiritual self and like how everyone in other bodies also is that, despite all external differences, then I'm considered a true seer of things, a tattvadarshi. And such person is required to lead a person who is not a seer and make him into a seer. Srila Prabhupada often uses this example: a blind man cannot lead a blind man. They will both fall down the whatever they fall down to. So this is very important, that one has to be on the road to realization, and only then one can also be a leader to others. Srila Prabhupada says in text 1328 in the purport, unless one has the association of a real knower of spiritual subjects, one cannot see these three things, means Atma, Paramatma and Prakriti, and their distinction. Those who do not have such association are ignorant. They simply see the body and they think that when the body is destroyed, everything is finished. So, we have the great fortune to be gifted with a legacy that Srila Prabhupada gives us just right there. You know, all the instructions. One form of guru association is the Vani. So even if you don't have a Vapu, a person that you have either not linked up yet, or like you have linked up but the person is physically not anymore present, the Vaishnava, still through this, through the instructions and meditating on the instructions, like kind of try to absorb them consciously, this is like being under the guidance of a bona fide spiritual master. I mean, that's what we preach. We consider Srila Prabhupada as the founder Acharya, who is in a role of shikshaku to everyone who is in this movement. And everyone who gets the books and sincerely reads them and follows them is on a path to self-realization. That's what we believe. That's what we say. It's our doctrine, so to speak. Yes, and also a bit later, Srila Prabhupada gives a bit more detail on what guidance, what guidance by a spiritual master means. And this is in 1335. I would like to read you this one. Can read the verse also. Those who see with the eyes of knowledge the difference between the body and the knower of the body, and can also understand the process of liberation from bondage in material nature, attain to the supreme goal. And Srila Prabhupada writes here, a faithful person should at first have some good association to hear of God and thus gradually become enlightened. If one accepts a spiritual master, one can learn to distinguish between matter and spirit, and that becomes the stepping stone for further spiritual realization. A spiritual master, by various instructions, teaches his students to get free from the material concept of life. For instance, in Bhagavad Gita we find Krishna instructing Arjuna to free him from materialistic considerations. And then he also, at the end of this chapter, he said, these things are meant for contemplation and for realization, and one should have a complete understanding of this chapter with the help of the spiritual master. So the verse of the Bhagavatam that we read today, which addresses these three items, Paramatma, Atma and material nature, and how they are related to each other, are actually essentially a very relevant topic in everyone's spiritual life. Because as long as there is no understanding of these three things, one is not really going anywhere, because one will be confused about the difference between body and self, Paramatma and Atma, material nature, and so on. Purpose of the creation. Recently in the class, I had listened to the class of Srila Prabhupada, and he pointed out, well, maybe many people might agree to or say, yes, God created the world. But then when you ask, why did he so? Many people might not know what to say, or don't have a concept of it. So pointing to knowledge or faith can be superficial. And of course every bit of transcendental spiritual knowledge you have is valuable. But we are encouraged, and to not just encouraged, but urged to go deeper, to absorb the mind, to try to really get always a bit further, like try to grasp and be more conscious of things, by applying a contemplative mood. It said one quality of a Vaishnava is that he is grave or thoughtful, that he's always looking at things seriously and like not being a kind of, how do you say in English, sentimentalist perhaps, who is just like, going with the moods and what feels good is good, but more like trying to be a seer of things, and whatever, when happiness comes, not be too much enthusiastic about it, but accepting it, but when distress comes, not be too much perturbed about it, but accept it and see and observe what's happening in both sides, and the more this happens, gradually, like sometimes I have little bits of experience of it, that you see actually it doesn't matter whether there's happiness or distress. To the soul, to the mind, it matters a lot. That's happiness. But if you look deeper, sometimes we feel, okay, actually in a sense, it's not really, it might appear as you're indifferent, but it's more like being conscious of the distinction that if the philosophy is, I have nothing to do with matter, and if it's true, so then I'm not affected by neither happiness or distress. And that's kind of also a marker where we can measure where am I standing spiritually, how much am I affected by things that happen in terms of positive, negative, happiness and distress. And it's a constant challenge going on. People like to do challenges nowadays. I don't know if it's still a trend. Sometimes in social networks people put like a challenge on this, challenge on that, and you do all kinds of stuff. But this is a lifelong challenge for everyone for someone who likes challenges can take up on that and move toward Krishna. Hare Krishna. Are there any comments or questions? We can have for a few minutes for that.
Well, yeah, we'll be always inspired to see someone practicing all these things, That's why when we read Bhagavatam for a couple of days, when we compare that experience with living with a person who is practicing Bhagavatam even for a few minutes, we get very inspired. I was talking to a disciple of Gaur Govind Maharaj, who was in Bhubaneswar. Maharaj left his body in 1996. Prabhupada's very senior disciple. Prabhupada asked him to build a temple. He literally started building a temple, making a brick, and he used to go in trance. Once he was chanting Hare Krishna and fell unconscious. Then people were around him for a couple of days and there was no movement in his body. He was like still. Then disciples thought, let us take him to hospital. Then His Holiness Radhanath Swami Maharaj said, no, call his relative who knew him inside out. And they brought him and said, just don't disturb him, leave him alone and sit and chant Hare Krishna. And Maharaj was physically, externally unconscious for more than 30 days. He was still. And devotees were like bewildered, did not know what to do, call a doctor, take him to hospital. Or after 30 days, he just woke up as though he's from sleep and continued. This happened 2-3 times in life. Amazing. It's kind of a bewildering. And in 1996 in Mayapur, he was speaking about Krishna, Jagannath pastime, around 7:30 p.m. in the night. And just leaned on the wall smiling and saying Jai Jagannath. Amazing. So whatever Prabhu has explained, I think we saw in that personality So when we see somebody who's practicing all those things, then we get really inspired. Something, that's what my understanding. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay then, thank you very much.
Thank you for the class, Prabhu. Yeah, you just mentioned about Paramatma in the heart of every living entity. So I just heard a class from Bhaktivigyan Goswami, and I think he mentioned there that, or that's how I understand it, that when you ignore God, like totally in ignorance, also Paramatma inside of the heart, of course he will be present with all the activities of the body, but he will be less present in the heart, like kind of in association, where you feel God in your heart, kind of. So if you ignore God, Paramatma will leave a little gap in the heart, and material-oriented persons try to fill up this gap in the heart with sense gratification. That's how he explains it. What do you think about that?
That's a beautiful explanation. Yeah. Yeah, Krishna chooses to withdraw if someone doesn't want to have anything to do with him. He is not imposing himself. He has other things to do. But yeah, it's a matter of reciprocation. Although in a sense he's neutral, because he's there fairly distributing karma, and the upadrashta anumanta, the overseer and permitter. He also in the verse Savasyas chaham ridisani vistumata smritya jnanam apuhanam ja, it's explained that the capacity of remembering and forgetting refers not just to daily life things, that you can remember your to-do list or your appointments or forget them, but it's about the more weighted, the deepest memory of who you are and what God is. And if you choose to not wanting to know that, he facilitates it. Okay, let you forget me. But if you choose to, okay, I want to remember God, and also he facilitates gradually the remembrance, and so we can come closer again. But he allows the distance as well. And yeah, it's a very interesting thought, the gap that is being created, and how this needs to be filled with material things. Yeah.
I just was thinking about, because I also knew that Paramatma is meant to be neutral. So how but now it makes totally sense.
Yeah, neutral is not indifferent. That's sometimes things we might mix up with things. But neutral means he's fairly, disposed to everyone. But of course, if someone has a desire, I'm inclined to a relationship, okay, he enters it, and then the game changes. But yeah, how would you expect if you have no interest in him, but saying, but you should bless me as you bless your devotee? But actually I don't care, I don't even believe you exist, so it doesn't make sense then. Wouldn't be unfair or not neutral.
And somewhere it's also mentioned, like if a soul is becoming a devotee, like Paramatma is changed with Krishna. Like,
it's also, I heard, I don't have a particular source, but yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, depending on the devotional development or inclination of the jiva in his practice, the Lord assumes then, or manifests according to the relationship one has. Okay, thank you very much, because I'm also, I get to have a bit an eye on the time. Time factor is merciless, so Granted, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.